Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope everyone is doing well as we are into our first full week of spring, although some places in New York it does not look to be spring. Just a few housekeeping notes. You must have been registered for this webinar in order to receive credit. Please know that it will require about 7 to 10 business days in order to have your credit posted to your portal, and you will receive a letter in the mail. Also, if you have a question during the webinar, please type them in the question box, and we will answer those as we go throughout the webinar. Today, I'd like to introduce Megan Lopez. Megan joined the National Alliance for Children's Grief in 2014 and serves as the National Program Director. Megan has served as a social worker and program leader throughout her nonprofit career and has provided support to children, teenagers, and families in a variety of settings. Megan is an experienced presenter and trainer using an interactive style in her teaching and facilitating on a variety of topics related to program management, childhood bereavement support, grief in the school setting, and group facilitation. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Social Work from the Texas Tech University and Master of Science in Social Work from the University of Texas at Arlington. Megan resides in San Antonio, Texas, with her husband and 2 children. And we are so thankful for the partnership between the New York State Tribute Foundation and the National Alliance for Children's Grief. Welcome, Megan.
Thanks so much, Kelly. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here today, and we are also grateful for the partnership we have with you guys. We're excited to help you support kids in your community during difficult times in their lives. So we're thankful to be here as well. Like Kelly shared earlier, I am a social worker, and I have worked in many different areas, including schools, hospitals, community-based centers. But in all of those different settings, the majority of kids that I worked with, I found that most of them were struggling. Those that were struggling were dealing with some kind of loss and change in their life and needed some attention in that area. So I transitioned from the school to the bereavement field in 2014. In 2010, and then came to the NACG about 10 years ago. And I am passionate about our mission in helping to make sure that no child grieves alone. And we believe that that starts at the very beginning, and that's where you guys come in. If we can help to make sure that the funeral is a good, healthy, comfortable experience for children, we can help to start them off with a healthy grieving experience. So let's jump in and see how we can support you and the kids in your community. Like Kelly said, I do like an interactive style. So if there's anything you guys want to share with me as we're going forward, please feel free to do that. You can drop any notes in the chat or put any questions in. I will stop a couple of times just to ask questions and just interact with you guys a little bit. So please don't hesitate to ask anything that you might be wondering or just might want to check in about. All right. So today, these are our objectives for today and what I hope that we're going to get through in our hour together. We're going to talk about how to have conversations with a child when someone has died. And you're going to hear me refer to it like that, when someone has died. I'm not going to ever assume and title someone as a loved one because people feel differently about different people in their lives. So I'm always going to refer to them as someone who died or their person or something like that, not necessarily their loved one. We're going to try to identify some ways to involve children in the funeral process and talk about ways that you can support a child during a funeral. And we're going to discuss some ways you can create some spaces, either large or small, in your facility for children and teens. All right, so we're going to start with some tips for conversations with children and teens concerning end of life. Here are 6 tips for conversations. We're going to go through each one of these today on the upcoming slides. A lot of what we're going to go over today is going to equip you to do 2 things. One of those things is to be able to support you in supporting the kids who enter your funeral home. And then the other thing it's going to hopefully equip you to do is to help you to support the parents who are bringing kids into your funeral home. So a lot of time as parents, we have questions about if what we're doing right, or should we be doing something different, or how can I best support my child? So some of the things that I'm going to share with you today might not be for you to share directly with a child, but might just be for you to help a parent better support their child as they're going through this time. Grief is hard at every age, and in an expected grief journey, expected journey of life, we don't necessarily anticipate having to explain grief and death to a child. It's not anything anyone wants to do. So parents and caregivers and support adults can use all the assistance that we can give them. So that's what we're going to try to do today, is just build up your experience so that you can better support the kids that you have coming in. All right, so we're going to start with grief is ongoing. As the child develops, so does the grief. Grief is different for everyone. We grieve differently and express that grief differently. Children are constantly growing, developing, and discovering the world. People always ask, what's been your favorite age level with your kids? And really, I don't have a favorite age. I think there's good and bad with every age. And every age, they're discovering something new about the world, about themselves, and they're giving up things, they're bringing on new things, and it's the same when grief is in the mix as well. Depending on where the child is developmentally will affect how they process the loss and respond to it. So when we look at younger kids, we can sometimes see with them an excess of questions and a need for repetition. There's a reason why kindergartners go over the alphabet constantly, or do a letter a week and go over the letter A 1,000,000 times during that week, and then the next week the letter B. They just need that repetition. And it's the same with grief. They don't necessarily understand that death is permanent. So they need that repetition, and that can be really hard for parents. And we can see that when parents come in to talk to us or to get extra support, that can be a strain and can be difficult for them. Also, with little kids, we may express the news to them, and then they might say, okay, I want to go play. And that's okay. Children express themselves through play. So it's expected for a child to get information or get news and then need to go express themselves through play in that way. It's okay for that to be the response they have. There's nothing abnormal about that or anything to worry about. That's just how young children express themselves. If we look at the other spectrum and we go to older children, we may see a request from them to go back to school soon after, and or to hang out with their friends. As a mother of a teenager right now, I ask, always for prayers for patience, but also I understand this. And I understand that their need to be with peers. Teens are constantly concerned with other people think of them. So their drive to return to normalcy gives them a sense of security. So however your child responds to the news or grieves or shows their grief, all of those things are okay. Everybody is just a little different. It's helpful for parents to know that multiple children in the same family can have very different reactions to the same death depending on their level of understanding, their relationship to the deceased, and the individual child and their temperament. I have 2 children, and I often say how weird it is that I can have 2 kids from the same 2 parents, and they could not be more different. We can help parents understand this and realize that each child might need a different level of support. So just helping parents understand that kids are different in lots of different ways, and that's going to roll over into grief as well. So not to be alarmed that their kids aren't responding in the same manner or the same way, and just helping them to realize that kids need different levels of support, just like they do with their homework or with their friends or anything like that. They also need that different level of support when they're going through the grieving process. So just kind of supporting them as they support their kids. All right, validation is key. All emotions are okay. That's something that's tricky and that may not be accepted by society, but we're going to talk about that a little bit. People go through a variety of emotions after someone dies. There can be sadness, there can be anger, there can be guilt, shame. There can even be a little bit of relief, especially if their relationship wasn't great, if there was abuse, if the person was sick for a long time and it caused a lot of strain on the family. There's lots of different relationships and emotions and circumstances that can change things and make people feel differently about a death. And all of those emotions are okay. We tend to put people on a pedestal after they die and only remember the good things and only talk about the good things. And for a child who might have had a difficult relationship with a person, that can be a little difficult for them and they can struggle with that a little bit. So just remembering to validate all their emotions and they're okay. We should also make sure not to assume we understand what a child might be feeling or label their emotions for them. It's not our job to tell a child how to feel or to guess how they feel. It's our job to listen and to take time with them to see how they're doing. All emotions are okay. I know I've said that a lot. I'm going to keep saying it. All emotions are okay. We can support children by helping them talk about and express their emotions. Expressing emotions is in a healthy way is difficult for any of us, but especially for a child with a limited understanding of what they're feeling, a limited vocabulary around the words to express what they're feeling, and just a limited ability to express themselves in general, it can be difficult. So if we can have patience with them and teach them to do that, it will help them in their grief process, but it will also help them in life in general when they get into difficult situations. Okay, talking about death. You guys are the experts on this, and I know that you're comfortable with this topic. I have attended some funeral industry conferences, and you guys have a lovely sense of humor around death and are very comfortable with all aspects of it. Our fields are similar, the children's bereavement field and the funeral service field, in that we are, two of very few fields where we are comfortable talking about death. In our society in general, it's not something that we typically talk about or invite questions about or share a lot of that information with children. So we're in a unique position to be able to help kids with this. What we can do that maybe no one else can is help children to understand that death is a normal part of life. And we can give them an opportunity to discuss openly and honestly. Being able to discuss death frankly and the way a child needs to better understand is a great gift that you're in a unique position to be able to give them. There may be things that they are more comfortable asking you, like logistics questions, than they might be in asking their parents. Or their caregivers, because you know the answers, you do this every day and you're comfortable discussing it. So you might get some questions from kiddos that they're not comfortable asking their parents, and that's okay. We encourage you to assist parents or with parents' guidance to answer those questions. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, but first, I want to talk about, as parents, it's our job to protect our children, right? And that protection comes in all different ways, from monitoring their online activity to knowing who their friends are. And then even in this situation, in their grief, we try to make it easier for them by adjusting our language and saying things like, just trying to smooth things over, right? Give platitudes and things of that nature. Or we say things like, we lost them, or they went to sleep. For children, those terms and others can be very confusing. I imagine if you told a child we lost them, well, why don't we just go find them? If they're lost, let's go find them. I lost my dog last week and we drove around the neighborhood and we found him, right? So that's not a good example of how to tell a child that someone has died. If you say they went to sleep, good luck at bedtime. We'll see how that goes. The death of a person in a child's life is hard, but when they aren't spoken to in a straight and direct manner and use the correct words, we can just make it more confusing for them. We encourage parents to use the words death, dying, died, among others, so that there's really no confusion in what has occurred. We always want to make sure that we speak to children age appropriately, and we always want to make sure that we give them small bites of information. Children don't need a huge, big reveal all. They don't need all the details in one setting. They take a little piece at a time. Like I said, I have a 14-year-old, and we started, I was always nervous about having conversation about sex, right? Like, how was I going to explain that to her? And just over the years, it's a small conversation that happens in bits and pieces. It's not something that we sat down and we went over the whole thing in one sitting, but each stage, different questions come up and different things come up and different things are appropriate for us to discuss and all of that kind of thing. So it's the same with death and grief. Different conversations are going to come up, and as children grow, they're able to understand things at a different level, and they have new questions and they have new things that they need to process. So it's not a big reveal. We just want to use simple, direct language with small bites of information for kids. All right. Our grief is shaped by culture, and we know this. We know that each culture has specific rules, guidelines, and ways that they celebrate life and death. I'm sure you guys are very familiar with all the different ways that different religions and different cultural backgrounds like to perform funerals. But there's also within individual families, we have specific ways that we celebrate regular things that happen in life. And how can we help a family or a child carry those things over into the funeral process? What traditions are important to them that they would like to see incorporated into the day? And how can we make that happen for them? So just taking the time to ask those questions and have those conversations with them, maybe give examples if they're tentative to have conversations or ask for weird things or out of the box thinking. Give them examples of things that you've done in the past or that you've been able to accomplish, just to give them ideas and give them the courage to ask for things that they need to make sure that the funeral can be what they need it to be, so that they can start this grieving process off in a healthy manner for them. All right. We want to support their decision and let the child decide how involved they want to be. When I worked at a bereavement center, the #1 question I got was, how involved should my child be in whatever was going on? Should I tell them the truth about the cause of death? Should I tell them what the next steps are going to be? Should I bring them to the funeral? That's a question we got a lot. Should my child attend the funeral? All of these things are hard questions and things that need to be thought through and considered, and think about the age of the child, the relationship to the person, who's going to be at the funeral, just all of those kinds of things when making this decision. But my advice has always been, yes, the child should be allowed to come to the funeral and or be involved in the funeral in some way. Should they be forced to go to the funeral? No. I always kind of reflect back to parents and ask, who's the driving force here? Does the child want to go and you're not sure? Or are you wanting them to go and they don't want to attend? Who's behind the decision that's being made? Is the child getting a voice in that decision, or is the parent kind of making all of the decisions for the child? I would also push back and say that I don't just recommend that a child attend a funeral, but I highly recommend that a child be involved in some way at the funeral. And we're going to talk about that next. So this is kind of the end of our first section here today. We've gone through the 6 talking points to discuss with kids. So I just wanted to take a brief moment and see if there's any questions or anything you need explained more clearly, or anything you have maybe encountered that you didn't know how to handle, anything like that.
We do have one question already, Megan, so I'll read that and give people a chance to type others in. So one funeral director writes, I have seen less children at a funeral, memorial, or visitation because the parents are protecting them since they do not know what to say, since they were never exposed or brought to them either. COVID stopped socialization and many are not back out socializing. Any suggestions to parents since we are seeing less of the families with abbreviated services?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great point. I agree with you that we are seeing less. I think it's just the encouragement, the education. You know, a lot of times with kids, when we don't have conversations with them or we don't include them in the situation, when they're left to their own devices to think about things, you think 2 + 2 = Z, right? When they don't have someone to process through with them and to talk to them about what's going on, their mind kind of goes to the worst possible scenario. So just encouraging parents to bring their child into this space, that it's good for them too, and encouraging them that they can control it. You know, they can control how much their child sees or how little their child sees. They can cater the ceremony or the ceremony to be what they need and what their child needs, and just being open to having those in place. I think it's also, you know, starts before that, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but community education too, and inviting people into the funeral home before they need you guys, doing those tours, connecting with local schools, trying to do assemblies or bringing them into the school to do tours. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but yeah, it's a whole education piece, and just I think encouraging parents that when they think they're protecting, they're really just keeping things from their child, and when they grow up, then they just feel like they missed out, right? So we just want to make sure that they get the opportunity to be a part of something, and just reassure them that you can make it as comfortable for them as possible. Maybe they don't want I do feel like children should be able to view bodies if they're comfortable with that, but maybe the parent is adamantly against it. So maybe the body's in a different room. Just things like that, ways that you can just try to make those parents feel comfortable. Any other questions, Kelly?
Yes. So one person asked if we will be able to provide any special books that are good and helpful for children regarding death. And Megan, I'll let you speak to this, but I do want to add that we do have some resources created by the National Alliance for Children's Grief on our website. It's actually on our Tribute website. But Megan, maybe you can speak to those specifically.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later too. I do have some book examples for you. I told Kelly before you guys hopped on that I'm moving, so I don't have all of my books with me, but I do have some topics. And if you want to reach out to me, I'm happy to send you some more books that we're familiar with, but we'll go over those a little bit later.
Great. Oftentimes we see guests bringing their children to attend a funeral or memorial gathering for a family member or mother or father's close friend. What is a best practice for behavior for these families? Many times the younger children are playing, and it is an awkward scenario to state that they are watching their children as they are paying respects to the family of the deceased.
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, obviously you expect there to be respect in the room, right? So maybe it might just be that you can come up with some kind of something to give the child as they walk in. Maybe it's a little coloring book or something like that, something that might explain what they might see in the room or feel. Sometimes when kids feel a little bit anxious, they're not sure what's going on, they can act out a little bit. or get a little overstimulated. So helping the child to feel comfortable, and then, just talking to the parents as they walk in. I think it's appropriate to be able to give expectations and let, people know, remind them of what is expected of behavior wise. And then, just something you can give the child. Maybe it's a little coloring book and some crayons that they can sit and be able to do during the event, and hopefully parents will appropriately parent. But that's a good question.
Okay, we have a couple more if you don't mind.
Sure.
We had a funeral in which the mother passed from a hereditary disease. The young daughter wasn't at the funeral, but did view her mom. The daughter suffers from the same hereditary disease. How would you handle such a situation?
Yeah, that's tough. I definitely think that child is going to need some additional support. So I would be really looking for what support is available for that child. I just think, whatever you can do in the moment to make sure that their experience is what they need it to be, giving them extra time or giving them, just some extra resources. But we'll talk about this a little bit later too. There's a Find Support page on our website where you can look for children's bereavement resources in your area to give to that family to just support them more, because they're going to need more support than you can give just in the funeral setting. If there's not a children's bereavement center close to them, then, just encouraging them to seek support for that child, whether it's individual counseling or connecting with their school counselor or whatever that looks like for them. But just having those resources and those offerings available to them. One more, Kelly?
Great. Yeah. So my 9-year-old grandson lost his father 6 years ago and his mother 2 years ago, but he never talks about their death. Should we bring it up to him or just wait for him to talk about it?
Well, yeah, so my encouragement would be, do you talk about the parents in general? Whether it doesn't necessarily have to be that you talk about the death. Sometimes kids don't talk about death to those caregivers or to you specifically because they're afraid it'll upset you. So just letting them know that it's okay, that you're a safe person that they can talk to, and then just practicing some modeling behaviors, talking about the people that they've lost with each other around the table at dinner, bringing up, oh, I remember when your mom used to do this, or did you know your dad did this when he was a little boy, or just bringing those topics up and making that conversation available to them. If they engage and they continue, great, continue those conversations happening. If they don't, you can just remind them it's okay to talk about them. We're here. We want to talk to you about them. We want to answer any questions that you might have, those kinds of things. And then you can decide from there whether that's enough or whether they might need some additional support. Without, being there, I can't tell you that answer, but just, giving the opportunity and modeling that behavior for them, letting them know that that's a normal thing and it's an okay thing for them to share and talk about, I think is how you start that ball rolling.
Great. And if you'd like, we can move on and then do more questions after.
Yeah, let's do that since we're about 30 minutes in. Keep going, and we will have time for more. Thanks, Kelly.
Great.
All right, so now we want to talk about involving children and teens in the memorial planning and service. So there's 3 times when I want us to focus on doing this. There's the before. We really need to prepare them before they walk into the funeral. This will most likely be a new experience for them and they don't know what to expect, and this can be anxiety provoking. So we can minimize that anxiety by just preparing them before they walk in, and we'll talk about ways that we can do that. And then number 2, during the event, just being present with the child during the ceremony. And then after, taking time to check in after the event. So let's look at these just in a little bit more detail now. So before, we want to involve the child during the planning phase. I want you all to think about back to your first funeral you attended. Think about how old you were. Think about who the funeral was for. How did you feel at the funeral? Who supported you? Was it a good or bad experience? I remember my first experience very clearly. It was my grandfather who died, and it was not great. So I decided when I came into this field that I was going to make sure that experience was different for my children. When my oldest was about 9, I took her to a funeral of a distant relative. She didn't know this person. She had no emotional attachment to them, but we went as a support to my grandmother and as a learning experience for my child. I highly recommend, if possible, that you take children to funerals before they are deep in mourning of the person in the casket or the urn. We talked about it just the other day, and she said, "Oh, remember when you made me go to that practice funeral? Teenagers are the best." But it gave her an opportunity to see what a funeral was and experience it without the emotions that typically come into that situation. So just gave her time to process things and understand, why do we do this? Why does this happen? How does this happen? Who does this? Those kinds of things, without having the emotional stuff behind it. But if you don't have the opportunity to do that, I would encourage you to encourage your families to bring the child in early for what they will see. Encourage them to bring the child to the funeral home a day or so before, or as many times as possible. If they can come in during the planning period and talk about what they want to see, or help pick things out or whatever, if they could come in the day before and talk about what the day's actually going to look like, what's going to be there, what things will look like, what things will sound like. That might seem weird, but if a child has never seen their dad or their uncles or their brother cry before, and more than likely they're going to see it on that day, preparing them for that and letting them know that that's okay is helpful to them. Let them ask any questions that they might have, and just have an understanding of what will happen and why we do the things we do. They might have some logistical questions like, why do we use caskets, or how is the body cremated? We encourage you to use age-appropriate, simple terms to describe these things. And then after you answer them, make sure that the child understands your answer. Make sure you didn't miss any steps. I once had a mom describe cremation to a child, and she described it beautifully. And then she said, "Do you understand what I said? Can you tell me back?" And she said, "Oh, now I understand why the person died." And she was like, "Okay, let's go back. Let's start over. The person died, and then we put the body." So just making sure that you cover all of the things that need to be covered. This will help prepare them for the day of. When they walk into a situation without any basis of understanding, we start filling in the answers for ourselves. With what our brain tells us. For children and their magical thinking ability, this can be very dangerous and scary. And that's how we end up with your classic, and you guys have told me this before when I've presented with you, your classic "where did grandpa's legs" question go, because half of the casket is closed, when the answer is actually very simple. We just keep that part closed and you can't see them, but his legs are still there. So having that chance to go over things before they actually walk into this space is very helpful. All right, during the event, we encourage you to find creative ways to be involved during the service. We want to give them an opportunity to do something. So take some time to discuss before the day what the child is comfortable with, but give them a chance to have some role in the day. My youngest child just joined a new soccer team this week, and she came home and she said, "I blocked a shot. I was useful." We all just want to be useful, especially when someone we love is hurting. We want to have a role to fill. So let's give kids a role in the day. Make sure this can be as small as picking the music beforehand, or handing out programs, or creating some art to place in or around the casket. Or if the child is more comfortable or a little bit older, maybe they want to get up and say a few words, or maybe they want to sing a song, or maybe they want to hold the door and greet people as they come in. Whatever it is, just make sure that the child is comfortable with the plan, and that in the day of, if they change their mind, make sure they understand that you have a backup plan in place, so that if the day comes and they decide, "I just can't do that," that's okay. We have a backup plan for this, and we'll take care of that. It's not a big deal, and it takes the pressure off of them. Some additional tips: you want to designate somebody to be with the child during the day. This might be a family friend, a more distant relative that the child knows and trusts, but maybe somebody that isn't actively grieving as the immediate family might be. This gives them a point person they can go to during when they might need a break, ask a question, or express emotion to. Like I said earlier with your question, sometimes kids refuse to show emotions to their parents for fear of making them sad. So just giving them that safe person they can go to and chat with. You want to encourage the family to arrive early. Even if they did that day before visit that we talked about, the space will look and feel different the day of. With everything actually in place and the anticipation of what it's going to be, the child will feel different in the space. So encourage them to give the child a chance to explore the space without a lot of people watching them. Outside people will have opinions on how children should or should not respond in this space, and that pressure can be overwhelming. So give your child just a chance to be themselves in the space and get their bearings before you let other people enter around. The more times a child enters this space, the more comfortable they will feel there. If you can get a child in multiple times before the funeral, you will give them a better chance of being more comfortable in an uncomfortable situation. Excuse me. Next, you want to make sure that there's a place they can escape to if needed. And we're going to talk about the details of that a little bit later, but it can be a space in the funeral home, or it can be a space outside, whatever it is that they need, but just a space for a break. If there's too many people or too many questions or too much emotion going on, gives them a chance to step out if they need to. And lastly, we want to do check-ins with the child, just making sure that the day of the event they feel supported, that the funerals are an everyday occurrence for you guys. But for a child, this might be their one and only time they've been in this situation, and unsupported, I know that it can feel very overwhelming. So we just want to make sure that we have a chance to support them during that situation. All right, and lastly, in this section, we're going to talk about after. After the funeral is also an important time to connect with the child. This can be something you encourage parents to do, or something that you do with the parent before they walk into this space. Before a child walks into the funeral home, they don't really know what questions they have, right? They've never experienced this before, so they might not know what they need to ask. But after, they might have a lot of questions because they've seen it and now they've experienced it, and that's when the questions are going to come up. So taking time to check in and see if any questions arose for them during the event that maybe you didn't cover before. It's absolutely impossible for us to remember all the things that are going to happen that day. And it's also impossible for us to see the event clearly from their perspective. So there will be things that we miss, and that's okay. We need to take time after to process and make sure that we clear anything up for them. Also, it's lovely if you can give them some kind of child-sized takeaway that's just for them, that they can walk out of the funeral home with. And after, like a week later or something, drop them a letter in the mail. Let them know that you're thinking about them. Address it just to them. Kids absolutely love to get mail, so send it directly to them, and just let them know that you're supported and you are thinking about them. All right, Kelly, that is the end of our section 2. Do we have some more questions?
We do, and one you did touch on briefly. Can you offer some advice regarding cremation? A person was once whole and now they are in an urn. The language seems quite important in this understanding.
Yeah, the language is definitely important. We want to make sure that we get that right. How I have typically described it to my own children or to other children is that after a person dies, you want to make sure you cover that first. After the person dies, we take the body and we put it into a very hot space, and the body turns to ash. And then we take those ashes and we do with them as we please. We put them in an urn, which is a very special container that holds those ashes, and we can keep that with us, or we can spread those ashes, or we can do whatever we decide to do with it as a family. And just keeping those, that language very simple and clean for them. There are kids that are going to be science minded, that are going to be older and more inquisitive, and they're going to have more questions for you. And if you're comfortable with it and the parent is comfortable with it, it's okay to dig a little bit deeper into that and to explain things a little bit more. We just had a webinar this month, and we had a funeral person on there who did a great job of talking about, what happens to the body during that process and all of that kind of stuff. I know it's more complex than I explained it, but just keeping it simple at first. And if they have more questions, you can kind of lean into that a little bit more. Some kids are naturally more inquisitive than others, and that's okay.
Great. At what age could a child be considered able to decide, based on his or her level of development, if she or he would like to attend the funeral or not, considering also the fact that each child is a different development rate stage that is not always based on age itself, but based on that particular child's level of maturity?
Sure, you kind of answered the question for me. It really is dependent upon the child, it's dependent upon the relationship, and it's dependent upon the family. There are families who let their children make big decisions much earlier than other families. So it just is dependent upon that. But what I would say is I don't think it's really dependent upon age or developmental stage or anything like that. I think it's more dependent upon what support we can offer that child. If we have the support available to support a very young child, then we can make that happen. If we don't have the support available, then I'd say we need to think about that and consider the options.
Great. What are your thoughts on the situations where the issue is actually the parents' anticipated fears, when the reality is that it is often the children that carry the parents through if they are able to attend?
Yeah, absolutely. It's just having those conversations with parents, talking them through it, just trying to get them comfortable with it. What do they need to be comfortable in this situation with their child? A lot of it comes down to just having those difficult conversations. So what I have done a lot with parents about lots of different topics is practice with them. Let's practice. You need to reveal bad news, or you need to have a difficult conversation with your child. Pretend I'm your child, and let's have that difficult conversation. This gives the parent a chance to talk through what they want to say and make sure that they're allowed to express themselves and get their point across that they want. So just giving them a safe space to talk that through, to ask any questions, to provide them with support, and to make sure that you make the funeral as comfortable for them and their child as possible.
In a conversation about death with a child, should you ever say everyone is going to die sometime and potentially frighten the child?
Well, it's the truth. I don't know about you guys, but in Texas, we have 100% mortality rate. So everyone is going to die. And that just is a fact of life. We see that in nature, when leaves fall from the tree, those leaves are dead and they're not going back on that tree. New leaves will come, but those leaves are dead. Having those conversations with kids from a very young age is okay, to talk about what's living and what's dead. And it's natural. Death is a natural part of life. It can be scary for kids. If they have a parent die, we often see a heightened fear that the other parent will die, right? So if mom dies, now they're afraid that dad's going to die. I can't promise you that dad's not going to die, but what I can promise you is that I have a process in place to make sure that you are always taken care of. I don't know if you guys ever saw that movie Stepmom with Susan Sarandon and Julia Roberts, but the little boy goes into his mom's room when she's near death, and he's like, she wants to give him a Christmas present and have this emotional time with him, and he says, but can you make sure she knows how to tie my shoes? Kids need to make sure that they are going to be taken care of. So putting those plans into place, talking to them, I am healthy, I take care of myself, I work out, I eat right, I do all the things that I'm supposed to do, but if I were to die tomorrow, this is who would take care of you. And this is how we would make sure that that process went. And I've thought about this and I've prepared for it. Those kinds of conversations are important to have with kids. They need to know that everything that's living will eventually die. And it's okay to have those conversations with them.
Do you want to do one more, or do you want to move on to the next section?
Let's move on to the next section and then we can come back.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. You guys have lots of great questions. Okay. So now we want to talk about spaces for children. We want children and teens to feel like the funeral home is a space for them and that they are welcome there. The goal is to create a space within the funeral home that feels safe and comfortable for children as they cope and process the death of their person who died. You can do this through offering tours to local schools, designating a space just for kids and teens in your building, and gathering kid-friendly supplies for children to use when they are in your space. So first we're going to talk about tours. If you're able to create a virtual tour, invite the family for a tour before discussing specifics, that's great. But even before that, invite children and teens into this funeral space before they have a need for it. You know, before modern medicine and the funeral industry, people were born and died in the home. Bodies were cleaned and dressed by the family and laid in the front room for people to visit and pay their respects. I, for one, am grateful that this process is no longer happening, but it did take away the mystery out of the process. The kids were just around and they saw everything, and there was no mystery or questions to be had for them. They were part of the process. Now everything happens kind of behind closed doors, and it leaves lots of questions for our young children. If we can get children into the building to experience that it's not a scary place and there's not something to fear, when they have someone they love die, they will be more comfortable in that space. It's a great opportunity to connect with local schools, provide a science lesson or career opportunity for them. If that's not allowable or available, then at the very least encourage the parents who's had someone died to bring their child in for a tour when they're making selections for the funeral. Like I said earlier, the more times you can get them into that space, the more comfortable they'll be there. Okay, so designated spaces. It's the availability of this space, not the size, that matters. So whether you have an entire room that you can dedicate to children, or maybe it's a corner of a room that's a permanent fixture in your funeral home, or maybe it's a temporary center that you can bring out, that you can roll out when children are present and roll away when they're not. Whatever you can do to give a child a space is important. We want them to know that there is space there. Ultimately, what I know and what I've seen in my kids is if we don't create a space for them, they will find one, whether they're crawling around on the floor, hiding under a table, or laying across some chairs. Whatever they do, they will make space for themselves. But if there's already one available, then you're telling that child, we want you here and you're welcome in this space, which can be very empowering for them. All right, some supplies. This is a list of supplies that we recommend. Obviously, you can add to it with whatever you have around, but these are just some examples that you might use. Easy things like papers and crayons, maybe markers if you're feeling a little bit more adventurous. Make sure that they're washable. I'm going to turn on my camera for just a second so you guys can see me. Play-Doh is always a good option. Can you guys see me, Kelly?
We can, yes.
Correct. Okay, I can't see myself, which is weird. So these little containers of Play-Doh are great because you can actually give them to the child and they can take them away, which just gives them something to play with. Pop-its and fidgets are a big deal and very handy. This one's kind of fun. It's a ball that you can play with. They make rings that kids can spin and pop, bracelets, all of those kinds of things. Pop-its are great because they're quiet. So I'm popping it and you can't hear a lot that's going on, and these are even more quiet. There's really nothing to hear here, which is nice if you're trying to have conversation, but you want to keep kids' hands busy. These little fidget spinners are fabulous. This is a twofer. It's a fidget spinner and a puppet, so it's extra fun. And then just anything like this. We all like to just have something in our hands to mess with. I've been messing with this little gummy bear the whole time I've been talking to you guys, just because it gives me a sense of calm, just have something in my hands that I can mess with and focus on versus focusing on what's in front of me. There are a couple other options that might be a little bit louder if you're more adventurous. This little guy is fun, but he does make a little bit of noise. Building blocks are great for kids. They can be loud. I prefer these because they're magnetic, so they stick together, so there's not as much tumbling noise, and they're also easier to store that way. Sand is also great, but I prefer kinetic sand. If you guys aren't familiar with kinetic sand, it's fabulous. It doesn't dry out, but it's moldable, and you can kids can play with it and mold it into what they want, and it doesn't create a mess. Like, there's no sand falling onto my desk right now. It doesn't stay forever in its form. It will eventually fall apart, but it's very clean. You can do little containers of them to give to kids, or you can put that in a tray like this and then give them something that they can use in that tray to play with it. Another louder option that I get judged for are these little fidgets. They're kind of fun too, but they're a little louder. So it's just something to think about in your space, if that's going to work for what you need or not. Okay, I think that's all that I have to show you. Okay, so books. You guys asked about books earlier. Want to go back to that. Unfortunately, I don't have a supply to show you, but I can give you some examples of some great books. The Rabbit Listened is a fabulous book that you can use with kids going through pretty much any kind of change or loss. It's about a child who has had something destroyed that they built, and a different animal comes in telling them how they should respond to that. And then finally the rabbit comes in, and the rabbit just sits next to the child and lets the child process things the way they need to process them. And the child does go through all of the things that all the other animals suggested, but does it in their own time. So it's just a really beautiful picture book about allowing a child to process at their own pace. Some other great books, The Invisible String is a great book talking about, this is especially good if a child is experiencing a lot of anxiety or separation anxiety specifically. It's called The Invisible String. When Dinosaurs Die is a great book. It's an older book, but it's a great book as well. But there's tons of books available. Anything that's talking about emotions is a good book to use with kids, just helping them build that emotion vocabulary and get that out too. Some other quiet toys that you could have in your space would be puzzles, board games, stuffed animals, things like that. I'm a little weary of stuffed animals just due to the lice possibility factor. Maybe that's just me being crazy, but just something to think about. Then child-friendly furniture is great if you have a more permanent space. A little kid in a big chair is awkward, but if you can have a little kid in a child-sized chair, that's just always a little bit more comfortable for the child and for the parent. You might see the parent be able to relax a little bit more if you have a child in a child-sized chair that they can maneuver themselves and work with the manipulatives that you've given them. Ultimately, you're going to want to consider the mess factor when you think about it, and the cost when deciding what to include in your space. I would encourage you to have some good storage available if it's not a permanent space. And then specifically for teenagers, if you want to have a space just for them, the other things we talked about were a little more kiddish. So specifically for teenagers, adult-sized comfortable seating, journals and pens, accessible snacks, magazines. Make sure that it's private, that they are not like they don't feel like they're in a fishbowl where everyone's watching them and being able to see them. And then also make sure that it's optional. They don't have to go to that space. If they want to be involved in the process and planning, that's optional for them. Or if they would like to check out and not be in the space, they can do that and go to this teen-centered space as well. Last thing I wanted to just chat about, the last time I did this presentation and talk to you guys, there were a lot of questions about special circumstances and when a child dies and how to kind of support that situation. I know we're running low on time, but I want to get through this and then save any time for your leftover questions. But we want to make sure that there's support. Sometimes parents might drop children off at a funeral. I personally would never do that, but I do understand the need for that. Or sometimes teenagers are old enough they can drive themselves. So just making sure that there is some support for them if needed. So I would connect with your local school counselors, administrators, especially the counselors, and just have them be available during the funeral. You know, not hovering, not monitoring their behavior, anything like that, but just being available so that if support is needed, they're there to give it. Space, like we just talked about. If kids don't want to be in the room, if they need that extra separate space, giving them that space to do that and having it available. Not necessarily a required room to keep them in, but an optional space that is available to them. And then again, back to the roles, giving them something to do, giving them meaning, giving them a role to do in the space. So whether that's as simple as handing out note cards as they walk in and asking them to write their favorite memory or write their favorite thing about the child who died, just giving them an opportunity to do that. And maybe you pick those up and you have somebody read a few of them, or maybe you put them in a book and give that to the family. Whatever you can do just to help them express. Maybe there's a couple that are appropriate to stand up and say a few words. Maybe a few close friends want to be brought in early to select music or to talk about stories that'll be told the day of. Depending on what's comfortable for the family, encouraging expression on the day for kids in attendance is so important. Lastly, and probably most important, obviously you want to go over this plan with the family and make sure they're comfortable with it. You want to check with them and make sure their wishes are respected and that they're able to mourn in the way that they need to. Some families may be open to it and want all of their child's peers and friends in attendance, and some may not want any other children at the ceremony. You may want to suggest to have an additional session or time where peers could come for a separate memorial service instead of being part of your formal funeral. If they're adamant that they do not want children at the funeral, maybe you can just help coordinate with the school and help the counselors offer a memorial service or a support group at the child's school to support those kids. But just figure out a way. When a child dies, it's very difficult for a community. So just figuring out a way that you can make sure to support those kids. Lastly, I want to go through some ways that we can support you past today. Some educational opportunities. We have monthly webinars that are free for our members that if you're interested in learning more about children's bereavement, we would love to have you attend those. We do a national conference every year. We just held it last week in New York City. This is webcasted across the country, so it's an excellent opportunity for you to open it up to your community. And it's an excuse for you to invite professionals in or families in, depending on what the topic is that year, to talk about children's bereavement and to open that conversation, and then maybe give them a tour of your space and letting them know that your space is a safe space for them to come into. And then we have an annual in-person symposium, and this year will be in Denver in June. Like I mentioned earlier, we have a Find Support page on our website, and you can type in your family's zip code and it'll pull up the closest children's bereavement center to them and hopefully get them a referral to that bereavement center. We have some free downloadable resources that Kelly mentioned on our website and also on your website as well, covering from how to do a funeral with a child, to how to tell a child that someone has died, to just supporting a grieving child and many other things. We create all of our resources through work groups. So we bring together professionals from around the country to work together to develop these. So it's not just one voice or one organization's voice, it's a group of professionals from around the country who come together to create those. We also have books for purchase. We have a family book, we have a caregiver child book, and we have a teen book that are available. And we're always looking for new ways to support you. So however we can do that, please let us know. If there's something specific you're looking for, send me an email. I'm happy to look and see if we have it. And if we don't have it, I'm happy to put it on the list of resources that we need to create to better support you. I know we're at time, that you guys had a lot more questions than I anticipated. I'm happy to answer any more if you want to stay on it for a little bit longer, or this is my email address, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have after today.
Thanks, Megan. I will go through the few questions that we still have, but for anyone that needs to get off at the 1 hour mark, just a reminder, I meant to mention this in the beginning. If you got disconnected from this webinar at any point, please let us know ASAP. Also, just a reminder, it'll take about 7 to 10 business days for this to be posted on your portal, and you will get something in the mail. And I want to thank you all for attending today. Okay, Megan, I once had a service for an infant and their younger sibling was playing on the floor near the casket during the wake. The parents did not address the fact that their brother was not going to wake up and play with him. How could I, as a funeral director, give better guidance for the parent? Is this my place to give guidance?
It's a tough situation. I can see how you would wonder if that's your place or not. I do think, I don't know how old the child was, and I do think with little guys, it's very hard for them. They don't have an understanding of permanency. So the parent might have shared that with them, might not have shared that with them. Even if they did share that with them, there's a good chance that the child didn't understand it and or didn't remember the next day that it was shared with them. So I would just say, I would always just hand over those resources. If you're not comfortable having that conversation with a child, we have some really great resources that are available. Download them, print them, hand them to families. Let them know, just say, hey, I know you have other kids. Here's a great resource for you that you can read through and chat with, and hopefully help you support your child. In some of those resources that I'm specifically thinking of, there's some age appropriate things for parents to be able to see, to understand why their child isn't understanding specifically what they're saying, or how their child might react to some things. So that's what I would say that I would do, is to hand over those resources to them and just encourage them to use those with their kids. I love that they were just playing next to. I love that that was made normal for them and they were allowed to play. But yeah, it's important that that child understand the permanency, but it's so hard at a young child age level to do that.
When do children on average understand the concept of death?
So on average, it's definitely different for everyone. I think that we're more like an older elementary range, maybe the 9 to 10-year-old range, third grade maybe, before they can really fully grasp it and the permanency issue. They can understand that they're not here anymore. That I watched a video the other day of a 4-year-old saying, my daddy's in the sky. So it is definitely difficult. So it's kind of an ongoing conversation to have with children as they grow to understand it. But again, it's different for every child, because every child understands things differently and has things explained to them differently and has different support systems in place. So it's definitely possible for a child to understand it earlier with the proper support and education.
A child who has been prohibited from attending a funeral, and because of that, even after going through counseling and therapy, has developed a great trauma. How could we handle that?
So I think definitely they need more support. I mean, I don't know what exactly you might be able to do in the funeral home. Maybe the parent-child counselor might be willing to redo a funeral. Obviously the body wouldn't be present, but just giving that child a chance to see what that might have been like and to be part of it. But I think all of that would be under the guidance of a counselor, and just making sure that they're seeing a good trauma-informed counselor to help them with that. That support is going to be really needed. We have centers around the country that, redo funerals, that have those mock funerals that happen so that kids can better understand and better see what things look like.
If the person is at home and will die there, should the child be allowed to witness the moment of death?
Again, I think it goes back to support. I think that's different for every family. So I think with some families, that can be a very beautiful thing that the child can be a part of. And I think for some families, that might not be a good situation for them. So if a family is able to support the child appropriately the way they need to be supported, then I think it can be okay. But if they don't feel like they're equipped to do that, then I think it's definitely something to consider.
All right, just two more. The kids I've been seeing here are playing with phones and computers. How do you feel about that?
So that is kind of an extension of their hand these days. I know it is for my child's hand, at least. Um, so I think that, just having a conversation about that, it's very hard to get it away from her. But I will say that that's how they express themselves, and that's okay. So if you, our teen book actually kind of addresses that a little bit more, and that might be on the website as well, but just talking about, what does that look like? How can they, post tribute to their person through their social media, or do they want to put that out there? How can they, maybe they are, chatting with a friend about how they're feeling or what's going on. Just not assuming that they're checked out because of it, or maybe they're checked out because they need to be checked out in that moment. So just giving them the opportunity to engage if they want to engage, and if they don't want to, not pushing them too hard to be forced to engage, is what I would say.
The next one is really just a comment. I often tell parents ahead of time to avoid telling their child or children that the deceased is sleeping, as it can make for a very stressful bedtime in the days ahead.
100%. 100%. I don't want to do bedtime after that conversation has been had. Completely agree with you.
And one last, what is the best way to handle the parents who are making it worse for the child?
Parents are tricky. My husband is an administrator in a middle school, and he often says the kids are not the problem. And sometimes it's the parents that are more difficult than the kids. So parents are tricky. And I think it just goes back to education and support, just helping them with giving them resources, helping them to read through those resources, modeling for them. If you get a chance to engage the child and see if they have any questions, modeling how you're answering those questions and the patience that you're showing with that child. Just also remembering that parent is going through a really difficult time too, and they're doing the best they can in this moment as well. So just giving them some grace in that too. But yeah, just, providing them with resources, providing them with maybe a counselor that they need to see, talking to them about counseling resources for their child if that's necessary, or children's bereavement center, whatever you can do to just help give the parent and the child as much support as possible.
Great. Well, that ends the question, Megan. Thank you so much. This is such a valuable webinar, as we've talked about this being one of the more difficult and undereducated topics that we are dealing with as funeral directors. So we appreciate it so much, and thank you all for attending, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, Kelly.